Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the crop protection session sponsored by BASF. Thank you. We've got 4 presentations this morning. A short one from me on the circumstances where we find ourselves in for crop protection. We've got one on more focused on production, something on stewardship, and then on disease resistance and managing it. I'm Guy Gajan. I've worked for the NFU as Chief Arable Advisor for the last 10 years. By background, I'm an agronomist, worked for ADAS in 1996, but I've been the policy lead for combinable crops, so dealing with legislation and commercial issues since then. So I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the NFU. We've got quite a serious issue on crop protection at the moment. You're probably familiar with the availability slide there that leads up to 2009, which is the last time the legislation was changed. So it gives us an idea of the direction of travel for crop protection product availability in the European Union. But slightly more worrying, you'll probably recognize some of the active ingredients that I've put in boxes there, fungicides and herbicides, insecticides and others. Those are the products that we feel are very real risk of being lost in the next 5 or 8 years as the new piece of legislation that was introduced in 2009 slowly gets implemented and comes into force. And there's some quite common products in there. Perhaps the glyphosate one there is a bit more alarming. It isn't perhaps quite as high on the radar yet as some of the others, but it is so widespread I thought I ought to include it for completeness. So some quite serious problems potentially facing us if we allow the direction of travel to continue as it has been in the last few years. Also want to say something on the Common Agricultural Policy at the same time. NFU, obviously, we're very closely involved with that. At the moment, there's still quite a lot of unanswered questions. We've got some guidance that's available on our stand about how the CAP is going to work on farm. But there's still some questions, for those that are a little bit more advanced in their thinking, wanting to use things like cover crops and catch crops. We haven't got detail exactly on what species are permitted, and some very strange absences there. This is a photograph of a tillage radish that we took in the US 2 weeks ago, being used extensively there to try and capture nitrogen out of the soil and save it for the next year's crop. This is sort of a carryover to avoid pollution and save some money for the farmers. But in the UK, it looks like you won't be allowed to use that at the moment until DEFRA can come up with some, let's say, clearer definition of what they'll permit. I'd say more accurate and helpful definitions. We've also got a few issues around whether or not nitrogen-fixing crops would be as useful as we hoped, hedge cutting, and also agri-environment schemes. We've got a group of people who've been denied payments on their agri-environment scheme from 2012 to 2014 because the government doesn't really want to pay the administration cost of seeing whether or not they're going to be double funded. If they're using a nitrogen-fixing crop, they probably won't be, we would argue. And at the same time, we've also got the Commission moving further and further away from market management. We used to have intervention, we used to have export restitutions, we used to have bigger import tariffs relative to the price. That's all being moved away from under the new CAP even further. But at the same time, we've also got more regulation of futures markets, which would be the natural option for farmers to try and hedge their price risk, would be to use futures. But the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive is actually putting the same rules that bankers are squealing about at the moment onto agricultural trade as well. So there's another sort of issues going on in the background that we have to work on. But moving to crop protection and the impact of the legislation, even before 2009, we saw significantly less investment from those ag chem companies that have been investing in technology to solve your problems as farmers and agronomists. We've seen a huge decrease in Europe's power, if you like, as a representative market for investment in technology. And the number of new products coming to the market per year has dwindled pretty rapidly. Probably if you remember back to the first slide, there was a thin red line at the bottom of new products and a very ever declining blue line of actives that were available to us. So it's quite a serious problem. The over-regulation, the regulators would argue it's an encouragement to innovate. Actually, in practice, it doesn't seem to have worked that way. And in fact, Europe's been seen as a less attractive market to put all the investment in crop protection. What happened in 1991 was that there was a directive made to try and manage the way that actives were registered in Europe. It probably was necessary because you had lots of member states doing their own thing at the time, and it made sense to have a more centralized register of products that were available in Europe that could then be applied as a product in each country. But it used risk as the assessment for whether or not those actives could be put on the market. So the classic idea that I think it was as a Greek scholar said, the poison is the dosed. That was looking at the active and the way it might be used and seeing if it was going to be safe in the environment. But it did still reduce registration, and it did reduce, as I was saying a minute ago, some innovation. In 2009, there was a regulation put in place, which is a much more severe piece of legislation to control the way actives are registered. It's very ambitious. Its implementation is still up in the air at the moment. There is no definition for some of the criteria that are in that legislation. And it relies on hazard. So if the product, for example, in a vial in a laboratory is deemed as hazardous by its nature, then the Commission is saying it shouldn't even be registered, no matter how it's used or formulated or how you use it in practice. I mean, the idea, instead of the poison as the dose, they're saying now don't even go there if there's a hazard. Unfortunately, they haven't actually identified how to define the hazard yet, which brings yet again more uncertainty. And I guess a bit of a barometer from my point of view on how this is working. We've now got the Commission complaining that too many people are using 5-year derogations for active ingredients at central regulation level, and then there's too many countries applying for emergency use approvals for 120 days to put products back into the hands of farmers because they can't control the pest. So the Commission is saying that there's far too much of this going on. Well, I would argue that's perhaps a symptom of the fact that the legislation isn't working too well. The other perhaps issue we've got with the legislation is that it relies much more heavily on modelling through computer models, which economists and others like. Unfortunately, they're very less inclined to use real-life data. So an example was we lost the product methiacarb as a slug pellet because it was theoretically going to poison wildlife. Well, in the UK, we have a register that anyone that finds a dead bird can take it to a vet, and DEFRA will pay for a post-mortem. There's real data on that. The only poisonings of wild birds are generally because someone's deliberately poisoned them, not because they've been picking up slug pellets. And so that's illegal activity as opposed to legitimate use. But that wasn't acceptable to the Commission, so they've still taken that product off the market EU-wide as a slug pellet. And then we also have to question who's generating the data. Water companies obviously want to make it as obvious and easy for themselves as they can to show that that the water should be kept as clean as possible. They've got a vested interest, you could argue. The Environment Agency also likes to see that regulations being implemented and wants to do more and more of it. We see that NVZs, that farmers are subjected to nitrate vulnerable zones, often when they complain that it hasn't been done properly, they actually appeal and manage to get out of them. So I'm not entirely convinced that all the data collected by agencies and presented to us is accurate. And of course the EU instinct, it seems, is to regulate first with the precautionary principle rather than perhaps using innovation and industry's own voluntary efforts to try and avoid problems in the environment. So we've got a bit of a problem with how these products are measured as well. So to take up the mantle, NFU and the Crop Protection Association and AIC have started working much more closely together on pesticide questions. We commissioned Anderson's to do a report sort of detailing the problems with the legislation and the economic impact that this would have if all those products were removed from the market. At the same time, back in June, we launched Healthy Harvest. This is a campaign to try and bring us together, if you like, and make sure that we're all talking about the same things at the same time to the right people, and we're more open with our information and share it a lot better than perhaps we have in the past. And just try and make people aware to tell our story that crop protection is really important, why it's important, and what the impact will be if you start to take these products away at the rate you have been. At the moment, we should really be doubling our production in the next 30 years, not halving it, and that's the sort of the real drive for us to do something about this now. One example, I was talking a minute ago about the fact that not all these, the criteria and legislation have been identified and defined properly yet. At the moment, the Commission are doing a consultation on an impact assessment for what would happen when they introduce a new definition of endocrine disruption. And these are the kind of active ingredients and products that we fear will be affected, in fact, removed from the market in pretty short order. Some of those are very common, and most farmers will have some of those products, if not most of them, in their spray stores at some time in the season, and do rely on them heavily as part of their strategy. And you'll probably hear about it in some of the slides in a few minutes from the other speakers. But we're really quite pleased that the Commission has done this, because they're not obliged to do impact assessments or consultations on pesticides. The precautionary principle says that you should do that, except if it's a pesticide, effectively. And then it's up to the industry to prove that there's a problem with their idea of regulation, rather than them having to actually come up with the impact themselves. So this is a big win already out of our campaign, the fact that we've got the Commission to accept that actually they have a responsibility to understand the impact of what they're doing. So it's really important that we get now agronomists and farmers to respond to this consultation and tell the Commission it's fairly straightforward, if you ignore some of the scientific questions at the beginning, what the economic impact will be on farm businesses and through agronomists or farmers. So we're encouraging farmers to pick that up and run with it and get that in before the end of before the middle of January. So here we've got some presentations here today. The idea is to be able to sort of pick up more information on how to demonstrate integrated crop management on the farm, and also to reduce the impact of crop protection products. Keep them in the field and out of water. As detection methods become cheaper and more available, it's going to become easier and easier to find these products either in food or in the environment. And it's really to give opportunities for you to meet the exhibitors today, ask them more questions, exchange some ideas. Please follow up on that consultation. Profit your businesses through innovation as well, because we do need to innovate constantly. We can't always look backwards. That's not what we're about in our campaign. And also to equip people to tell their story to the public, to MPs, MEPs. We've got an election coming in the spring. Make sure you remind your MP how important the crop protection is to your businesses. So first of all, we've got Craig Morgan. Craig is the head of technical R&D at AgriVista. He's going to talk about the practice of production, new solutions at field level, and how to bring them into your business. He's got 30 years of field trials experience of putting these innovations to use and de-risking them from the farmer's point of view. So look forward to hearing from you, Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, as we say, that as Guy has just introduced to you today, I'm going to talk to you on practical solutions to some of the changing regulations. The political and regulatory landscape is going to change. There's nothing we can do about that. But the thing is, we don't know the full extent of the changes just yet, which makes it pretty difficult from an R&D perspective, because we're trying to second guess lots of things every time. But we're doing our best. Some things we know, and some things we're taking for certain. Like it or not, there is not going to be a plethora of new active ingredients entering the UK market in the next couple of years or for the future. Fact of life is there will be less actives, less solutions in a can coming from any of the manufacturers as the marketplace and the demand for regulation becomes higher and higher and higher. So we have to over and accommodate that scenario. We know a little bit more about the CAP reform now and the 3 crops and the spring cropping, and I'll cover some of our development work on that for you as we progress the presentation. So just to recap and really, really emphasize this is what potentially could happen. There are 87 actives on the list. Of the insecticides, 9 are considered high risk. We will lose potentially 9 insecticides. We will potentially lose 17 herbicides. Some of the effective residual herbicides we use in grass weed control programs today may go. So we have to find new solutions. What frightens me more than anything else, and there's an obviously campaign going on, the fungicide area. 12 fungicides which we know and love today. That's potentially under risk. And of course, 2 other products, basically molluscicides. That's the mainframe political agenda. But what else could come on the horizon? How does this affect our R&D? What do we have to be aware of? Well, everybody's aware, potentially, the Water Framework Directive, where we could lose some of the main actives we use in oilseed rape herbicides, because of Water Framework Directive. Another interesting aspect which may come to affect us in a few years' time is drift control. Already happening in the States. I'm part of a global corporation. Well, global corporation, we have partners in America where this kind of legislation and the impact of drift control technology is being heavily looked at in the States, and I think it will come to the UK, and I'll cover that a little bit later. But probably, again, what not many people are actually grasping is that if some of these products actually survive, the surviving products, some of their labels may change beyond recognition which you see them today. You could have a change in some of the rates which you're allowed to use. You could have a change in the maximum number of applications. You could have a change in the timings. We've already seen in the last 2 weeks, 2 products have come out with aquatic buffer zone recommendations on. And those aquatic buffer zone recommendations have then been involved with drift reduction technology. So we have 30 meters on top of the aquatic buffer zone with drift reduction technology having to be applied to the field using there. And towards the end of the thing, I will talk to you about the impact of that on a biological interface. And never mind what happens with legislation, our major weeds and major diseases become more and more resistant to our existing armory, and we know that today. So how has that affected our thinking in R&D? Well, in AgriVista's R&D, we're trying to move away from a kind of single product evaluation comparison. And we've got several projects ongoing. In 2015, we're looking very seriously at grassweed control in cereals, which could be affected by resistance to the ALS contact herbicides we have today. Could be affected by legislation if we lose some of the base level residual chemistry. Cereal fungicides, we all know, well, Jonathan will talk to you later about resistance. We already have some potential legislation on some of our key actives we're using today, and in oilseed rape herbicides and fungicides, as I've discussed. So let's take this one stage further. I'm going to talk to you a little about 3 topics of projects which are ongoing for us. Potential loss of fungicides and herbicides, looking at different cropping patterns, and then looking at applications. So we'll take number 1 to begin with. Potential losses of herbicides and fungicides. Easy thing for many people in the room today. Don't worry, there'll be a new one coming along. There will not be many new ones coming along. Gone are the days where we're probably introducing 5 or 6 different actives every year. So what has happened as AgriVista? Well, what we've done in AgriVista, and I'll show you a little bit more in a minute, is actually take an existing piece of chemistry, an old piece of chemistry, which has had use on other crops, and actually move that to make it a use on a new crop. So it was used on another crop, now if we use it, we already have 2 patents in AgriVista for the use of an old piece of chemistry, for use as a cereal herbicide, and a use of old piece of chemistry to be used in oilseed rape herbicide. We're looking at different timings and techniques, particularly on cereal fungicides, and we're coupling that in with some imagery technology, which I'll describe in a minute. I'll also be talking to you about different cropping patterns using specific cover crops. Let me be really, really clear on this. There's been some fantastic work on cover crops in the past, but this is cover crops of a different dimension. These are cover crops which were specifically designed to be of use in a cereal grassweed sector, but then for use of spring cropping later on. Looking at oilseed rape on growing in wider rows, and then finally talk on applications. So let's start. Typical picture of an AgriVista blackgrass trial here. Very strange person in the UK. I pay very good money to rent land from blackgrass. I leave a bit of a mess later on, as you can see. So we can bring an old active with a new active to the crop. And what I'm going to try and do here, if you can try and see, I'm sorry we don't have a pointer available today, but you can see the aerial photograph on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you see the imagery, which has been taken from what has been unmanned aerial systems, what I like to call drones. So taking that across the system here, quite clearly, rather than show you bar charts and masses of data, you can clearly see if it's green, it's good control. If it's red, it's poor control. It's the untreated. But can you see to the top 3 or 4 lines there to begin with there? particularly the top two lines, the long lines going where the color changes. What is fascinating about that is the same chemistry, the same day it's applied. It's just applied in a different method, by a nozzle configuration or a water volume change, and I'll explain that a little bit better to begin with. So let's explore a little bit further. So just imagine if we can change the red bar there, which is the untreated, if we can actually improve that efficacy using some old chemistry, so it's been around for a long time, and bring it new to the crop. What you can see on the far left-hand side is a heavily dominated green sector. That is entirely due to bringing that old piece of chemistry into the new sector of the cropping, into the new wheat cropping area. This active has not been used in cereals before, but should be available soon, going through the registration system. And there may be many more actives which we'll have to look at as an R&D company and development organizations going further forward. If you take the same principle with cereal fungicides, and there's lots of work going on with cereal fungicides, looking around there, using older protecting chemistry. It's the real buzzword of the moment, using lots of old protecting chemistry. It's working incredibly well in mixture with the existing chemistry we have, targeting leaf layers. But here's a word of warning, here's a word of fear. Some of the existing protecting chemistry which we have today is under threat. So some of the programs which we're looking at may not be available in the future. And it's not rocket science, I shouldn't use that phrase. It's well known within the cereal pathology sectors. If we were multi-spraying for rust trials with a rust-active triazole, that's been known for many years, and we were really successful last year with that. When we look in the sectoral element, where my big fear and doubts are, we looked in 2013 and 2014, and in 2013, we were a ton per hectare lower than our best traditional SDHI-based chemistry program. Where the disease was more prevalent, in 2014, we were 2.5 tons below where we are today. We were still producing a yield increase, but we were below where we are today. So this is something to be really aware of for the future. If we move on to points looking away from actives now, let's move away from the can, let's move away from chemistry and look at something else we're doing at this moment in time. We have a 5-year project going on in Northamptonshire where we're looking at a specific cover crops for grass weed control and the integration in spring cropping. Again, there has been some fantastic work going on with many an organization looking at cover crops. But this is cover crops from a different dimension and a different thinking. It's taken a long time and work across Europe with some European partners here to actually develop this specific cover crop. This specific cover crop, linked in particularly for growing cereals on heavy land, not a problem at all, can fit in nicely with a 3-crop rule. We end up, and I'll show you, in year 1, and then with better grass weed control, we do not use any contact ALS chemistry in these programs. And of course, potentially less fungicides being used. So imagine if you can go from the left-hand side, this is where I pay lots of money to get a massively untreated population of blackgrass. You go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, and you have, for maybe some of you in the room, acceptable levels of control. But that's the level of control using the best chemistry we have today, 3 spray programs based on pre-emergence, based on trialate, and based on ALS contacts. And that's the control from last year. And we don't always get control as good as that, but that's the situation where we're working with today, and many people in this room will probably have worse fields than that. But imagine if you can take the same field and move from the untreated to a crop of spring wheat like this. This is year 1. We'll be 5 years into the project, but our success in year 1 was phenomenal. By growing these specific cover crops, which I'll speak to you more in a minute about, and then drilling in with spring wheat afterwards, we reduced our population of blackgrass to a level which was below 5 heads per meter squared. Everybody knows that spring cropping's got to be good for grass weed control. The difficulty is how can you reliably do that all the time, particularly on some heavy soils. so moving from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, was achieved by growing a specific cover crops which consisted of black oats and vetches, and that's where they look like just before the point of desiccation, destruction, in February, March time, and there's the spring wheat crop afterwards, after that situation. That composition of black oats and vetches was specifically designed so for many reasons, and I really want to explore this with you now. And it's not a covering crop. It's not a covering crop to give massive ground cover to begin with. It's not a covering crop where you want to have a smothering aspect. You drilled in early August, it's drilled in August, early September, and it's drilled at an incredibly low seed rate. Now, it's drilled at an incredibly low seed rate for a specific purpose, in that we want spatial arrangement. We want gaps. We want the blackgrass or the ryegrass to actually germinate within this cover crop. We want it to be there. We want it to germinate within this cover crop. So it starts off with a very low growth pattern. It doesn't smother the blackgrass. The blackgrass germinates all through the autumn. This year we've taken it to a step further. We've even straw raked or raked through the oat vetch cover crop to stimulate even more blackgrass germination. The blackgrass germinates all the way through, and then in November, December time, the black oats start to move over. They take up the moisture extraction. They start to become a big biomass type feature. And then the vetches are with you, and you're looking at the soil condition of the vetches all the way through. Destroyed then, and then we direct drill in the springtime. It's been a phenomenal success. It's been a phenomenal success looking at the spring cover crops, moving into spring wheat. The other aspect we've been looking at is actually hybrid rye. Same field, same systems, growing hybrid rye. And we've worked with KWS Magnifico, phenomenal yields last year, only using residual chemistry, no contact chemistry at all in that situation. And hopefully you can see from the presentation the difference in blackgrass heads of the survivor, much less viable seeds in the bottom right-hand corner to the top there, and that's been very successful. So, there are some problems coming forward, and we've been driven to looking at different solutions, but I don't think it's all bad. The way the new regime's working with the 3-crop rule, the way the regime's working with specific cover crops being allowed in there, the way we have to change certain fields on grass weed control where it's totally out of control to come into reliable spring cropping in that situation. So in our 5-year rotational aspect, we're looking at a rotation, a very typical 2-straw rotation, whether it's wheat or barley, followed by oilseed rape, and then we'll follow through later, to a potential rotation where we stand today, and we may change, development changes, into a rotation which is completely different, a September drill cover crop, followed by spring wheat. Year 2, a September drill cover crop, followed by spring wheat. And year 3, all the way through in that situation, exhausting the grass weed seeds and still maintaining the yield platform and portfolio. Coupled with that, we're looking at the hybrid rye system, again, followed into winter wheat. So there are opportunities, and the opportunities are out there. So there are solutions which do not have to come out of a can. So if we lose actives, if we get resistance, there are solutions. We're in the infancy of this kind of work. We're out there now. We're going to do this. Will be our 2nd year of the project. We will learn more as we go further forward. But it is actually looking very exciting at this moment in time. And then if you combine that with imagery, as you go through, and I'm a great lover in this imagery as you move further forward, it has to be refined, but it's quite great. It's good for weed mapping at the moment. Weed detection is where I need to go to for the future. Just imagine on the left-hand side, you're flying across the estate. What could you do in there? Well, in the top left-hand corner, where you have to be 3, 4 years old, you can walk, you can talk. That's a field of blackgrass. That's not a problem. That can go into a cover crop. As you move to the right-hand side of the picture, and I'm so sorry there's no pointer, did you move to the right-hand side of the picture, you can start to see the odd spots, the odd red dots where the blackgrass is starting to appear. Could be ryegrass, could be brome, could be anything in your portfolio. That's where we can take some better remedial action. whether we look to load more residual actives, whether we look at some more thermal weed systems going along that route, but where we can combine this new technology with imagery, and it will become a real future prospect as we move through the industry. Applications. I grew up in the research station, and I've done all my life, or the majority of my life, on the left-hand side, where we walk with a handheld sprayer. And every product you have in this room today, oh, in this, not this, hope you haven't got in your room, every product you have in your sheds today have been developed this way. This is the registration system. Every manufacturer develops their products this way. You go along there, through the small plot replicated trials, major problem. Major problem's the walking speed. That tractor, the maximum that tractor can deliver is 3.6 kilometers per hour along that route there. As I say, I grew up in the research station, and hopefully some of you will come to the Agravista stand afterwards and speak to my application colleagues, because they really triggered my mind and my imagination. Growing up through the research station and just moving up through the active chain, you're always looking for better and better performance. But some of my colleagues have shown me the difference, and I couldn't believe this to begin with, the difference a nozzle type, a nozzle configuration, or a water volume thing could make to the biological activity was phenomenal. So what does this mean in reality? Well, I think there are going to be some major problems with applications as we go forward, particularly in the aquatic buffer zones, and bigger buffer zones being allowed only maybe, say, 30 meters with drift reduction technology. As I'll show you in a minute, the drift reduction technology could have some big impacts on biological performance. And as Agravista, my colleagues, and you can see here, have actually converted a Fraser Agri-buggy so we can do replicated trials. Doesn't really want to get too complicated today, but we can go actually do everything you can do in a small plot trial, but with speed 1620K. You can change the direction of the nozzle. You can change how they alternate on the platform. You can put twin lines on the system. And the biological difference is immense. I hope this shows up for you in this slide. Here's an extreme picture of the differences you can occur. Again, it's black grass, just so you can demonstrate some problems. On the left-hand side and the right-hand side, it's the same piece of chemistry. Same piece of chemistry, it's sprayed on the same day. The only difference with the piece of chemistry is the nozzle. On the left-hand side, it's gone through a 3-star LERAP rated nozzle at 1.5 bars. On the right-hand side, it's at 3 to 4 bars, both delivering 100 liters per hectare. That is the difference in the biological interface. There is fantastic work going on in research stations around the world, and particularly in the UK and Silso, where we're looking at the impact of drift reduction. And I think we're incredibly lucky in the UK to have that facility. What is not happening in the UK, what is not happening in the UK to date, is people taking that to the biological interface. And that's one of my big fears of some of this change in legislation. We're clearly showing differences. We're clearly showing differences of how this could happen. So there could be certain fields where you have a 30-meter buffer zone on, well, if it's 60 meters wide, the field, the whole field is sprayed with drift reduction technology systems. That is fine. That's a legislative thing. That's allow you to use the product. All I'm saying today is that questioning whether the biological interface has been looked at this level, because I have a feeling that we won't achieve the same results which you are achieving today. If you look, and I hinted to you earlier on about some of the work we work with our colleagues in America, and you look at drift control agents. I'm looking here, the same herbicide applied on the same day. We're looking at the impact of boom height here to begin with, and we're putting in product A, which is a drift control agent, product A, and we're putting in a product B, which is also a drift control agent. Now, I stand here today telling you about how you should be worried about some of the legislative changes, but it may come as a strange, I am actually lobbying as well today for some more legislation. The more we understand the drift control agents, the more I think it will be more effective at a farm level. There are no requirements, to my knowledge today, for anybody to actually prove the efficacy of a drift control agent. Anybody could market it. That comes with its problems. Anybody can enter the market, and therefore you have a very cynical approach from some, a very skeptical approach, and I don't blame people for that. The one thing you cannot do with these drift control agents, you cannot assess them. You cannot evaluate them by going through handheld spray equipment. They have to be done going through tractor, farm, practical based 4D. This is happening in the States. This could potentially happen in the UK. And we have to start to work hard and understand the impact that these kind of products could have on our armory. The change in the biological ability of these products from the left-hand side to the right-hand side is obviously phenomenal. And this could happen with lots of other things, including cereal fungicides. Finally, in the terms of the Water Framework Directive, we've obviously been looking, and many people have as well, about oilseed rape establishment, growing oilseed rape, wider rows, getting the seed rate right along the row to begin with, basically with the aim of inter-row spraying. So taking the inter-row spraying with a total herbicide up between the rows, and then just treating the rows of herbicides as we would have done years ago in a sugar beet band spray system. So applying our residual herbicides, applying our slug pellets, just down the middle of that row, probably applying the actives in 1/3 of the dose of which they'll be applied for overall, just in some hope and aim to stop some of these things getting into water. That's looking to be a very successful project. Coupled with that is that, again, if you look around, some of you may have heard or read about some of the work. It's called companion planting. Actually putting things like berseem clover or vetches actually in the rows of the oilseed rape. Not only are you getting a better, massively different soil structure situation happening at all, but we're investigating the impact that has on pest control. And it's very anecdotal to begin with, and we want to explore even further, but there does seem to be some impact on pest control here by having these things actually in the row of the oilseed rape. Changing the way we do it gives us new opportunities. So, undoubtedly, some changes will cause major problems. And I have no doubt some of those major changes and problems will come in cereal fungicides, in fungicides per se. That will be a major, major problem. But some of the other things which are happening may give us new opportunities, may spur us to do something a little bit different, may make us look at growing crops in a different way, looking at the specific cover crops, looking at the introduction of the spring crop in that situation, bring in some new thinking, and we could actually bring some new solutions. So in summary, I'd like to just highlight the fact that I think the UK has some excellent high-level R&D. You have the likes of your just to name things, the Rothamsted, your Silsoes. You have some fantastic high-level R&D. And I don't actually believe information is a problem. Information is not the limiting factor. What I honestly believe the limiting factor is the integration of the high-level R&D at a practical field-based R&D level. And if there's a plea for me, is that I think the whole industry, both from my side of the industry to the farming side of the industry, we are not going to gain anything further forward. We are not going to achieve what we need to achieve unless it becomes more collaborative. You may think, and I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes here, you may think we have collaboration today. Well, standing as I do from an industry part of R&D, I don't believe we have collaboration to the level at which we should have collaboration. I'm looking for collaboration where we just don't work with one organization. We should be working with 2, 3 organizations, everything peer-reviewed, everything audited. And therefore, you just don't get the opinion of one person, one organization. You get the opinion of many. And it has to be done properly. It has to be done properly, and it has to be done at a practical level. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope I've given you a few ideas about where we're looking for our R&D, and I hope I've given you some ideas that it's not all bad. There are some problems, but there could be some solutions for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Craig. And if we had more time, I'd probably be able to sum up what you were saying, but perhaps we'll have a little bit of time at the end, and maybe any luck, some time for questions as well. Next up, we've got Rob Gladwin,
I've been kitted out,
program.
so I've been kitted.
Rob is BASF's UK Head of Sustainability and Business Development. Unfortunately, the previous speaker is unwell today, but Rob stepped in. He's going to take over the presentation, which is about the profitability and stewardship of herbicide in oilseed rape in particular. Rob was previously head of marketing, but has an agronomy and farming background. So I'll hand over to you, Rob, now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Guy. So I'm going to give you an insight into some of the stewardship activities that we've been implementing in the UK this previous autumn, and how we're reacting to the introduction of the Water Framework Directive. So a few facts about agriculture first. Obviously, we've got 7 billion people on the planet. That is increasing. So there's an ever increasing demand for land and also for production. So we're actually going to be needed in the future, which is good to know. But also, that is putting great demand on water as well as an industry, both in terms of the fresh water that we're using, but also the protection of the water around the farm. And there are areas still where we need to improve efficiency. And as we've talked about, and Craig has indicated, there are still things we can do to boost efficiency, whether that's control of difficult weeds, pests and diseases, in the chain and also along the chain in terms of production. So there are a lot of challenges to sustainable agriculture, both from a UK perspective but on a global basis. And the focus of today really is in the middle band, particularly around water use and water protection. For us at BASF, sustainable agriculture must fit these 3 pillars. Economic, to ensure that you are profitable, and if you're profitable, that is sustainable. And sometimes that is a dirty word, but actually that is critical if you as industry are going to continue to invest and grow food. But also we need to be aware of the ecological and societal elements as part of those 3 pillars. And obviously in the UK, there tends to be a lot more focus on the ecological elements of farming as well. In some cases, quite rightly so, but sometimes that can be potentially at the expense, particularly of the economic. So one of the areas which is taxing the industry and will increasingly come into focus is around water and the Water Framework Directive, which is in the process of being rolled out and over time. And there are the legislative and regulatory challenges with that, but also as we go forward, that has the potential to develop into the commercial challenges in terms of the products that you have available to you to grow certain crops, and also then how that is introduced in the specific countries and what those challenges are, particularly when we're looking at is for drinking water and where that water is coming from to provide drinking water, whether that's borehole or surface water. And as a result of that, then we have the stewardship challenges which are then introduced into that to affect the overall performance of herbicides, but also have protection of water in mind. Limits already exist for individual active ingredients, so that's 0.1 parts per billion, and they're the only figures I'll throw around. And also in terms of total pesticides that can appear in water of 0.5 parts per billion. So there are already targets set, and it's quite clear as we go forward if we have exceedances, and metaldehyde has been very much in the focus of this, and many of you will be aware of that, but other herbicides will come into focus, that this has the potential to restrict sales. It also has an impact on the industry overall, both as us as manufacturers, but also as you as growers. And ultimately now there is the potential for those products to be removed as a result of breaching the exceedances for specific herbicides in water. The focus of today and the focus of what we're doing as a business is looking at oilseed rape, because there is a big focus in that area, and particularly on oilseed rape herbicides. Also for us as a business, and this goes back over a number of years, bentazone and groundwater, but they are 2 very specific herbicides and two groups of herbicides, and the problems and issues around them are different. So I've already touched on quite a bit of this in terms of the Water Framework Directive, but it's quite clear that this is one of the biggest threats to the availability of oilseed rape herbicides in general. So metazoclor is in the frame, as is carbetamide, as is propyzamide. So this has potential challenges in terms of how oilseed rape potentially would be grown in the UK in the future. And its expansion is protection of all water bodies, including those used for drinking water. What member states have to do is achieve good status by 2027. Now you can argue that is a long way away, which it is, but there are phased measurements going on, and the end of 2015 is one of the first phases where they'll look at where we as an industry, or where DEFRA have got to in terms of the water frame, or the Environment Agency have got to with the Water Framework Directive. It will also then be reviewed again in 2021. So we have to be seen to be showing progress and positive movement in terms of reducing exceedances. Otherwise, we have the potential for fines for UK government, but ultimately it potentially loading back into the regulatory system where we're not getting compliance and those herbicides coming under pressure. What is quite clear from a product stewardship perspective is we need a broad toolbox of active substances and solutions on the marketplace to ensure that we can continue growing certain crops. So how are we approaching product stewardship within BASF? So we've made a step change in the way we want to promote product stewardship. So we want to move to a more proactive approach in this area to allow us to get on the front end of this rather than be fighting a rearguard action once the herbicides come under a great deal of threat. Incorporating the needs and thoughts of farmers in this, because ultimately if you guys are unable to actually implement the product stewardship, there is no point in us actually devising it. And also then taking that step of encouraging farmers into more sustainable practices related to these herbicides. So BASF has been actively supporting a number of initiatives across Europe, and I think it's also worth saying this isn't just a UK issue, it's a European issue, and it isn't you as UK farmers being singled out here. And this is an activity which is going to run across the whole of Europe, and as Craig's already indicated, and also into other parts of the world as well. But Europe is very much the focus. So there's the TOPS programme, which is operating in many European countries, and that's basically the equivalent of the voluntary initiative which we have in the UK. And we've already made significant strides forward as an industry in terms of best practice, and we want to build on that, and also not complicate the messages which are going out to you as growers. So we look at the whole supply chain in terms of product stewardship, but obviously in this case we're looking at the integrated pest management and the responsible use elements and pulling those out. So just to give you a flavour of what is going on in Europe in terms of the TOPS initiative, is basically preventing, and most of this you'll see and will understand from the VI, is basically what we're looking to do is prevent pesticides getting into surface water accidentally and removing that potential issue, particularly around the farm and spills around the farm. There is no reason why we should be getting that kind of contamination of water. Reducing surface water contamination by spray drift and runoff from applications to crops, and again, attention to detail in that area. Best practice management methods developed, and Craig, I think, has touched on some of the initiatives which are ongoing in terms of other R&D, in terms of looking at the row spacing, inter-row cultivations, and band spraying to reduce the level of AIs that have been, or the level of application that is going onto the crop. And also information and training materials developed, which are then shared with stakeholders, advisors, and also other stakeholders in terms of best practice. So that gives you a flavour of what's going on in Europe. So if we bring it now back to the UK, so what we did this last autumn was launch the Metazoclor Stewardship Initiative. And one of the critical elements we also did here was to also try to come to you as an industry rather than individual manufacturers. So for the first time in a sort of groundbreaking activity, we're doing it in partnership with Adama, who are one of the other organisations that are marketing metazoclor-based products into the marketplace. And we hope other manufacturers who are involved with metazoclor will also come on board, because again, it gives clear direction to you as an industry. Most of this you'll know. Obviously, the profitability of oilseed rape has declined over this last season. However, it is still a profitable break crop and is a key element of crop rotations in the UK, and we need to maintain its position in the market, position on farm, particularly on heavy land where you get problems with spring crop establishment. It also obviously gives you the benefit in terms of early establishment, enabling effective management of your fixed costs and also labour at that time of year, and also to control problem grass weeds in the rotation. It's important that we say that to you as an industry, but also that we're saying this to politicians and also to the regulators, so they understand the role that these crops play in terms of arable production today. So why is it under threat? As I've already talked about the Water Framework Directive, and as a result of that, DEFRA have increasing concerns of the oilseed rape herbicides that are appearing in water. And there will be a consultation potentially towards the end of this year into early next year. Keeps being delayed, and also you'll be aware we've got an election next year, so there may be some further delays in that consultation. But they are going to come out to industry to ask what is the best way of actually stopping oilseed rape herbicides getting into water. And the Crop Protection Association are very clear that we want to put forward a proposal for water stewardship, which is self-regulation of the industry. So us as an industry taking care of it under voluntary means, rather than it becoming statutory and it appearing on labels, which will basically potentially restrict your ability to operate with certain herbicides. We feel that's the best approach, and also if you look to the VI, that's also been very successful. So that will come out and that will go through into the consultation. But what we decided to do was to reduce this threat. We wanted to do further work and get ahead of this to try and start promoting best practice. So this is the schematic of the best practice that we put out into the marketplace. And the critical thing is, particularly the stuff on the left-hand side of the slide, is this is basically reiterating what is under the voluntary initiative. What has been shown with the TOPS program, that if we as industry stop talking about particular initiatives, the level of awareness and the level of adherence on farm does decline. So we need to keep refreshing memories in terms of best practice. And we want to basically build on the VI. So we're not bringing forward any additional measures in terms of best practice, adopt the practice which is already in VI. But what we will be doing is offering additional advice related to the active ingredient. And certainly from our perspective, as we go forward, drained land, and particularly is a particular issue where metazoclor and movement of metazoclor to water is an issue, and this is where the focus will be for this last season and also going forward into 2015. What we also want to do is build in the agronomic thinking in this area, because we feel that's actually very important to actually get stewardship adopted on farm. And actually, if you've got good attention to soil structure and seedbed preparation, which is good from an agronomic perspective in terms of getting the crop through the ground and rapidly established, it also would be good for metazoclor stewardship. So that is part of the overall approach. Also, timing of application is important. The later we go into the autumn season, the higher risk we have of higher rainfall events and therefore movement to water. So we're looking to try and get oilseed rape established in the ground in early September, certainly by the first week, and avoid this later sowing date, which immediately moves the herbicide application later into the autumn when we're having higher rainfall events. And also then avoiding the use of metazoclor on drained soils after the end of September. Again, it's to do with levels of risk. And we've had quite a lot of discussion about, if seedbed conditions are not good, should I just ignore that? What I would say is if seedbed conditions aren't good for establishment, the chances are it isn't going to be good for the herbicide. And actually, by delaying and getting better establishment, actually will be as good for the herbicide. So the dates there are there for guidance, but obviously the individual field situation is also important. That's a summary of the metazoclor stewardship activities. So we're building that in as part of the VI, as I've already said. It's available on various websites that you can get at, both from BASF and ADAMA. Also, we're looking to basically bring in additional training for use in terms of the products and understanding how the products behave once they're applied to the soil. And as I've already indicated, we will be building forward for 2015 to offer further guidance on dose, rate, and timing. So that's going to be critically important. We're not done. Just to emphasize what I was saying in terms of getting the crop away well, that is particularly key for oilseed rape. And again, it's coming back to the agronomy of the crop and understanding that. Not only in terms of the herbicide, but also withstanding slug and flea beetle damage. Also, if you've got bigger crops, they're also better able to withstand foma infection and are more competitive for later germinating weeds, particularly blackgrass. And also that can then aid later season applications of some of the blackgrass herbicides which will be going on, which Craig already has indicated in his earlier presentation. At the moment, we're in pretty mild conditions, but also to withstand winter conditions, particularly when it's cold and wet. And so that is also an important element of that. And we would also say it's easier to manage a bigger crop going into the autumn than a poor crop and unsure whether it's actually going to make it through the winter, and the management decisions that then triggers going into the spring. So most of this I've covered. Because what is good for the crop is good from a herbicide efficacy perspective, but is also good from a metazoclor stewardship perspective. So we're looking to reduce surface runoff from the soil and soil erosion, and particularly where that is running into rivers. Good soil and good crumb structure basically means that you've got a gradual phasing of that structure down the soil profile, which is acting as a sponge, to soak up water and retain water, but also stop that movement of the product through the soil profiles. And also, if you've got poor soil conditions, the herbicide isn't breaking down as quickly, and therefore it's hanging around for a longer period of time beyond what is needed from an effective weed control perspective. And again, then where you've got rainfall as you go into the autumn and into the winter, you've got greater potential of movements to water. And also to be aware that cracking, and particularly where it's significant, is basically a superhighway or very quick movement, offers quick direct movement to drains, and particularly where that's on drain soils. It's also important to understand and communicating both back to the industry, but also again to politicians, that yield protection from a herbicide is important, and if we lose this early season option, the potential for yield loss is quite significant. And over the last 7 years, yield responses of up to over 0.5 ton a hectare have been seen where weed control has been delayed significantly going into the autumn. And particularly where we're looking at lower seed rates, that potential is even higher and is building as we go forward. Another area to look at is also the use of grass buffer strips, and this is particularly to stop surface movement of herbicides from the field. And I think with the ecological focus areas we've got and the potential to be putting buffer strips around, we would be encouraging growers to actually put those around round watercourses, because that is a good aid to protect this surface runoff. 6 meters is a minimum to actually give effective control, and also the makeup of the buffer strip is also important to stop that lateral movement. It also has biological benefits as well from a biodiversity perspective in terms of useful pollinators, farmland birds, etc. And there's further information on the voluntary initiative site related to that. So hopefully that's given you a flavour of what we're doing related to the Water Framework Directive as an industry, and being proactive in terms of trying to defend the herbicides that we've got available, particularly with related to metazoclor. And by using the best technology and the best R&D, hopefully we're able to maintain that technology for the longer term. We do need a respect for product stewardship related to AgChem use going forward, so we maintain those products. And also that means that we've also got respect for not only for water, but also biodiversity. And ultimately, we're all of us an industry ambassadors for sustainable agriculture. Thank you. Thanks, Guy.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rob. We are sort of running slightly behind schedule at the moment, so we won't have much time for a recap or questions in this format, but certainly please do go and ask the people that are speaking or the other exhibitors questions on the stand after the event. Now we've got Jonathan Blake. He's going to give us a presentation on individual action you can take to reduce the collective risk of disease resistance, both the breakdown from the ag chem and from the crop. Jonathan's worked with ADAS since 2001. He's a principal research scientist at Rosemont, crop pathologist, and also a farmer in Lincolnshire. So I'll let you take the floor, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Can you all hear me all right? That seems very loud, actually. I hope that's okay. I think it's fair to say disease resistance to fungicides poses a serious threat to UK wheat production because we rely on fungicides to get the most out of our wheat crops. Just how much do we rely on fungicides? Well, I think this represents the yield benefit that we see or have seen over the last 12 or 13 years from applying fungicides to wheat. This is actually taken from the HGCA recommended list sites where they had both fungicide treated and untreated yields. And so it's analogous to the sort of yield response that we see across the UK. And it varies significantly from one year to the next as to how much of a yield response on average we see across the UK. But on average, it's around 2 tonnes per hectare. As a broad figure, that's a reasonable estimate of the yield response across all varieties and sites. Last year, because of a mild winter and a very wet spring, that actually rose to 4 tonnes to the hectare. Now, when you consider the cost of an average fungicide program, if we said it was around the cost of a tonne of wheat, you're getting 4 times out of that, what you, on average last year. So it's clear there's a sound economic case for using fungicides to boost yields in wheat. But it's not just about the economics. There's also a very good environmental reason for using fungicides. Some of any environmentalists in the room might think that's a strange thing to say, but actually it massively reduces the carbon footprint of wheat to increase the yield. Those pathogens reduce the fixation of carbon, and if we allow that to happen, and actually the cost of fungicides in terms of carbon cost is actually quite small. So per tonne produced, we can improve the carbon footprint of wheat with the correct use of fungicides. Fungicide resistance can be described as a bit of an arms race, and that, like any other arms race, involves one side tooling up to cope with the munitions of the other side. The advantage I think that we have, unlike in this example, where the police always seem one step behind the robbers, within fungicides I think we are, at the moment at least, one step ahead. SDHI fungicides are still very active at the moment, but we don't have that many tools, and we are only ever one step away from seeing a mutation occur in the pathogen that confers resistance to that pathogen and puts us in a position where our weapons are useless. So there's always a concern there that resistance will occur. In most products, there are a number of products, and Craig touched on these earlier, that are effective and continue to be effective. They're not as active as some of the newer chemistry that we have, but the phthalamides, dithiocarbamates, chloronitriles or Folpet, Mancozeb and Bravo, for those of you that prefer the product names, have been around for over 50 years now, which is phenomenal really. And to put that in perspective, if you can consider what spraying equipment would have looked like 50 years ago, well, that might be at the bottom there an image of of how those products were being applied there. Nowadays it would be utterly absurd to spray a field without a fully sealed cab and all the personal protective equipment to go with it. back then, well, he had a tweed coat and a flat cap. That was enough PPE for him. Yeah, absurd to think how things have changed in that time. But we still have these multi-sites, and they're not as active as newer products. But even though they're not active, even though they're still only providing perhaps something between 20 and 50% control of septoria, they have a very significant impact on the effective life of newer chemistry when they're used with those newer chemistries. And there's some very good modeling information to support that claim. When it comes to the single-site modes of action that we've had over the years, we've gone through a succession. MBCs in the 80s developed resistance following their introduction 10 years earlier. The DMIs, the azoles, they started, we saw the first of those in 1980, and with the last introduction in 2010 of prothioconazole. And more recently, we've seen a very gradual slide in the efficacy of the most effective of those products, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Strobilurins were the most stark case of fungicide resistance that we've had of late. Following their introduction in 1996 with cresoxim-methyl in Landmark, a number of other products came to the market. By 2002, they were being used widely and often on their own. And it was in 2002 that we saw the first signs of a mutation, the G143A mutation, occurring in September. Might have occurred in September. It was in Septoria, and that conferred resistance to Septoria populations. Thankfully, with the SDHIs, they've been around since 2005. That said, in 2005, for the first 3 or 4 years, it was just bosclid, and that wasn't being used as widely and was probably not quite as selective on Septoria. But we have had them out there for 3 or 4 years, being used widely in wheat, and to date, we have no resistance to SDHIs in wheat on Septoria, I'm glad to say. And the priority is to make sure that we continue with that situation for as long as possible. We do think it is likely that SDHI resistance will occur, but the longer we can hold that off, the better, and the things we can do to do that, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Just to put it in perspective as to how long we expect fungicides to last, a colleague of mine looked at this in some detail and looked at the time it takes from the introduction of a new fungicide to the point in which you see resistance develop. And he looked at a whole range of cases across Europe, looking at different modes of action and different pathogens. And he found effectively most fungicides, or if you were to pick one period in which fungicides tended to fall fastest, was after 3 to 4 years after introduction. And actually, interestingly, in the first, you might have thought that it would be the first year or two, but actually, that's that period of fungicide introduction. Its uptake in the industry is usually quite limited in that first year or so. So it's not surprising that it's around the point at which it's widely used. And if you consider that around halfway across that graph is about 10 or 12 years in, most of those cases occurred before we were 10 or 12 years in to that mode of action being used. If you consider we're now 9 years into SDHIs being used in wheat, we're about halfway through that, which is quite reassuring in some respects. But I think the general consensus out there is that resistance may well yet occur and is likely to. I mentioned Septoria and the strobilurins. Many of you will be familiar with what happened here. There was a step change and a very fast change between 2002 and 2004 in both protectant and curative activity. We saw a change from around 80% control from a dose of an SDH, a strobilurin, I should say, to about 20% control over 2 years. And that was a direct reflection of the change in the pathogen population. That selection pressure that we were putting on by applying strobilurins selected for the G143A mutation very quickly. It's a very common, it happens exactly the same in antibiotics in medical world. if you have a resistant isolate, it is very quickly selected for. And there doesn't seem to be any fitness penalty for that. So there's no reversion in the absence of strobilurins being applied. Interestingly, you might take away from that strobilurins have no effect on septoria. They actually, interestingly, do still have some small effects. And we saw these in the years after that mutation occurred. Actually, Stephen Kildare in Ireland looked at this in some detail on a whole load of isolates that had that mutation. And he found that actually pyraclostrobin and to some extent azoxystrobin do reduce the germ tube length of spores landing on the leaf. And that was surprising. We thought they would have no impact at all. We thought it was just purely physiological impact. That was the reason we were seeing a small yield improvement. So it's still possible. I mean, we would not suggest anybody relied on strobilurins to control disease, but they may still have a part to play in helping to protect other chemistry. When we look at the azoles, it was a completely different pattern of decline. It's been a steady, slow change over a period of time, and it's basically a whole host of different mutations that I won't go into today occurred and have occurred that have conferred a little bit less sensitivity to the pathogen, to the fungicides that we're applying. Epoxy and Protheo remain the two leading azoles in septoria control, and where we might have been getting 80% control in around 2000 from a half dose of either of those products, we're now looking at nearer 55 or perhaps 60% control from a half label rate in a protectant situation. Where we look at full rates, actually the decline is less stark. And so, yes, clearly there is a rate effect. And we would say that using high rates of azoles is clearly going to be much, much more effective than using a lower rate, and maybe an effective way to protect the SDHIs. So keeping azole rates up is a clear message coming out of the work. The change that's occurred in septoria isn't unique to the UK. This is actually some information from Denmark, and they saw a slide in tebuconazole on the right, going right back to about 1994. Oddly, actually, in many places in Europe, they haven't seen the decline in epoxy and Protheo like we have here. It's been, until this year, perhaps deemed a bit of a UK phenomena, France perhaps being the exception to that. But yes, last year, the high pressure that was had right across Europe seems to have shown their weakness there too. And the right-hand graph, you can see left-hand graph rather, dropping off quite starkly towards last year. Seems that our isolates are going over there. What can we do? You might say, well, why don't we just grow more resistant varieties? And yes, that will reduce the selection pressure, but the problem is there's no win-win situation here. There is a direct link between high-yielding varieties and septoria. This just graphs the top 20 varieties on the HGCA recommended list from left to right, and you can see the decline in yield as you go across there on those bars at the top. The orange just represents the yield response each of those had to fungicides last year. Overlaid on that, I've put the septoria observed in those trials, and you can see there's generally more septoria in the highest yielding varieties. This is well known that there seems to be a yield penalty for disease resistance in wheat. That said, there are some varieties that are less prone to septoria and still very high yielding. And selecting those varieties, those such as Evolution, Diego, Grafton and Panacea would fall into that category, those that have points below that line. By selecting those varieties, we do reduce the selection pressure on the fungicides that we're using, simply because there will be less disease on those varieties and we'll be putting less pressure on the fungicide to work. When it comes to how we actually manage the SDHIs now, there's some very good guidance out there, and essentially I think we've learned our lesson from the situation we were in with strobilurins. Solo use was used back then, and it is clearly a bad idea using them on their own. equally limiting the number of times they're applied. The less we expose the pathogen to the fungicide, the less likely it is to adapt and select. On top of that, we need to be using them in mixtures with other modes of action, with activity on the target pathogen. So using mixtures is a key part of that, and by mixtures we're talking both azoles and the multi-sites wherever possible, to help make sure that we maintain these fungicides for longer. There's been a lot of questions as to whether different SDHIs select in different ways or have different mechanisms. Generally, it's considered that that is not the case. And certainly, in terms of FRAC and FRAG guidelines, mixing 2 SDHIs is not considered an anti-resistance strategy. It can be done, and actually, if you do it in one tank, it still only counts as one SDHI application, because it's one SDHI timing. But yes, it won't probably do anything from a resistance perspective. So really, I would say fungicide resistance, or to resist fungicide resistance, there are 2 strategies, 2 main strategies anyway. The first of those being use our fungicides more effectively, minimize the use of the at-risk partner. The less we use SDHIs, the less we select for SDHI resistance. So using them where we need them is the key. But also applying them where we do use them in mixtures with other modes of action. And I mean, the use of multi-sites is a key part of that process. They can have a significant effect on reducing the increasing the effective life of these products. Clearly, though, varieties is an area we should be looking at as well, and wherever possible, use of varieties to reduce that selection pressure further is a sound strategy. Thank you very much.